The punishment for practicing witchcraft? Execution. And so this frail old woman was taken from the town jail to be hanged at a place the people of Salem still call Gallows Hill.
We believe that the victims of the trials were hanged here in 1692 on 4 separate days. There are accounts that the victims went to their deaths with great dignity, said goodbye to their families, and it was a very sad, sad occasion on each of the hanging days. 14 women and 5 men were hanged.
Most of the victims were women?
Yes. But there were a quarter of them that were men. It's important to remember that.
Now, if you're accusing people of witchcraft who are on the fringes of society, I can see how that would work. But once you go after people like Rebecca Nurse, a scion of her community, then I see that it's a little more problematic.
I think this is a fascinating period on our history because it is so complicated. I think there are lots of motives, perhaps property, perhaps power, perhaps revenge. All of those things played into it. I think one of the most important components is fear. I think people were terrified.
The fear was of the devil, the enemy of God. Violent intervention was the response. But the execution of these witches was also an exchange, as it was for the ancient Egyptians and the Maya. The people of Salem believed lives had to be taken to cleanse their village of evil. The graves of many of the accusers and prosecutors are still here in the town cemetery.
Now, this is a very violent thing to do to a community. It's a reign of terror in a way.
But this was a violent time, you know? I think the idea of capital punishment wasn't foreign to these people. Certainly people were beheaded, they were drawn and quartered. I mean, this was what happened to people.
So why was this link between religion and violence, or religion and public execution in this case, so strong?
Well, they lived under a certain approach to God. They were Puritans. They followed the Bible according to their minister's interpretation of it. That was the basis of their lives. And when something threatened that, they needed to take action.
The Salem Puritans were using the power of religious belief to enforce a form of order. In this case, a personal political order. These killings were considered legal, but they occurred within a system that based its laws and judgments on strict religious beliefs. The link between violence and religion began as a sacred exchange. The belief that brutal acts would benefit the community by appeasing the gods. But over the centuries, the lines blurred between righteous devotion and political or personal gain.
This is the Plaza de Armas in the center of Lima, Peru. On Christmas Eve in 1736, dozens of people accused of heresy were brought to this square for what the Spaniards euphemistically called an auto de fe, an act of faith.
Thousands watched as victims were spat on, flogged, and some even burned alive at the stake.
Like the Salem witch trials, these executions were overseen by religious leaders who'd been given nearly limitless legal power. But this wasn't a local, isolated incident in a small village. It was part of a global reign of terror carried out in the name of religion. And it was called the Spanish Inquisition.
The Inquisition was a ruthless institution, a kind of court established in 1478 by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain. The stated goal was to root out heretics in the Spanish Empire. By heretics, the church meant all non-Catholics, Muslims, Jews, and Protestants. This exploitation of religious authority gave rulers nearly unlimited power to persecute their enemies. Spain opened an office of the Inquisition in every colony that it possessed.
One of the most well-known people to be put to death here in Lima was a woman named Ana de Castro. She was known for 3 things: her wealth, her beauty, and her pride.
Ana was born in Spain to a Jewish family. To avoid persecution, Ana and her parents converted to Christianity and emigrated to Peru.
Here in Lima, she was accused by some of her enemies of practicing Judaism in secret.
she was arrested and brought to this building, the site of the Inquisitors' prison, to meditate on her sins and to find God, by order of the church and the state.
Well, these are small tunnels. Look at this.
Luis Carpio is a guide at the Museum of the Inquisition.
They had to think about the crimes committed.
In complete darkness?
Yeah, and also alone, yeah.
So this is a recreation of one of the cells?
Yeah, the punishment cells.
And the accused would have been placed in here for how long?
More or less 8 days, alone in the dark. They had to meditate, to pray, to think about the crime committed, and after, well, confess.
And if they didn't confess after being in here for 8 days?
Well, some of them were taken to the torture chamber, yeah.
What kinds of torture did the Inquisition here use?
There were 3 kinds of tortures. One of them was the rack, one was the water torture, and the pulley.
In the pulley torture, the prisoners' arms were tied behind their backs and they were lifted in the air, their own weight tearing muscle and bone.
Okay, so what if the person doesn't confess?
They were excommunicated, and after they were sent to the secular arm to be burned.
Ana de Castro claimed that she'd done nothing wrong and refused to recant. So the Inquisition sentenced her to death by fire. The stated reason was religious heresy.
There's another motive at work here, an economic motive. Remember, this is a wealthy woman. When they burned her at the stake, they confiscated her property, and all of that property went to the office of the Inquisition.
From the late 15th to the early 19th century, the Spanish Inquisition subjected over 100,000 people in both the Old and New World to secret trials. Many thousands were put to death. No one knows exactly how many. Wealthy Jews and Arabs were favorite targets of the Spanish Inquisition. But this abuse of religious power was nothing new.
Clearly, the connection between religion and violence was no longer just about bringing order to the cosmos. The Inquisition wasn't practicing a ritualized violence like the Maya or the Moche. It was legalized torture meant to further political power over a terrified populace.
Coming up, the Bloody Crusades, and one of the most contested holy cities in the world, Jerusalem. Jerusalem, a holy city for 3 major religions, and one of the most fiercely contested sacred spaces in the world. No other city has such a long and complex history of religious conflict and violence. Professor Nimrod Luz is a cultural geographer who studies the city itself, examining what happens when competing religious factions are all forced to live so closely together.
Jerusalem carries so many connotations and emotions for so many people. And this is why Jerusalem is a puzzle.
Every block I go to, I feel like I'm in a different city.
City.
I feel like
Yeah.
I'm in Egypt, or then I feel like I'm in Tel Aviv, Israel.
Since everything is so important to everyone, everybody wants to make a stand here. And even things as trivial as having a shop becomes, in a sense, if you want, a political statement.
This city is so sacred to so many that people have been willing to exchange their very lives to claim it, all in the name of God. At the top of a medieval tower called the Damascus Gate, Nimrod shows me the site of one of the bloodiest moments in Jerusalem's history. At various times, Jerusalem has been under the control of Jews, Christians, and at the end of the 11th century, it was ruled by Muslims. The fortified city wall still remains, surrounding the oldest part of Jerusalem. In the year 1095, Pope Urban II called on European Christians to wrest control of Jerusalem from Islamic rule. mercenaries, soldiers, and even common people left their homes in Europe and began walking to the Holy Land. They had been recruited with promises of absolution for their sins, but they were also attracted by tales of fabulous riches. Loot, they were told, should be theirs. They believed that their Christian righteousness entitled them to whatever they wanted.
And after 3 years on the road, which is something inconceivable today, they finally reached the city of Jerusalem. We're talking Friday in a Muslim city. Not a stone throw away from us, the wall is being breached. And it's a very dramatic moment. They start to infiltrate the city. Once they're in, all havoc breaks through.
So they breach the walls.
They breach the wall and a massacre starts here.
And so the Christians come in and they slaughter men, women, children, everybody.
Whoever they find, indiscriminately, Jews, Muslims.
How many people are we talking about? Do we have any idea? Tens of thousands?
Thousands.
Yeah.
Thousands of people, surely.
The Crusades were an act of violence perpetrated by Christians. But over the centuries, each faith has been responsible for aggressive acts against the other religions. And of course, this volatile relationship still exists today. As I walk through the streets, I can feel the tension between members of the various faiths. That tension is a part of everyday life here, seen in Jerusalem's markets, its neighborhoods, and in its grandest, most defining monuments. At the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, Christian pilgrims arrive from all over the world to see the site where most believe Christ was crucified, buried, and resurrected. Overhead, an Islamic minaret still stands, issuing the call to prayer 5 times a day. This sort of uncomfortable juxtaposition is everywhere in Jerusalem. Just a short walk from the Holy Sepulchre is the western wall of the Second Jewish Temple, a site of Jewish prayer, mourning, and celebration. This is a touchstone of Jewish identity. And just above that wall, 2 sacred Muslim sites, the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Muslims believe Muhammad ascended to heaven from this very spot. These are 2 of Islam's most sacred spaces, right next to the most tangible source of Jewish identity and the site of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. This proximity has been the source of conflict for generations. In Jerusalem, religious beliefs and traditions have often led people towards sacred violence. The motives are the same as they've been throughout history and around the world. Pleasing the gods, or one god. Vengeance. And political or financial gain. Sacred violence has always been an exchange, a belief that people can trade brutality for order and peace.